Hello, welcome to our third installment of test reviews, this one for the unit entitled, Was the American Civil War Inevitable? At the outbreak of the war, both sides brimmed with confidence and were assured of a quick victory. The growing divide of the past 40 years created two distinct nations, each with strengths carried into the war. Stop the video and examine the charts carefully. For Lincoln, the goal of the war was simple: to invalidate the idea of secession and preserve the Union. However, his job was complicated by dealing with others with different war aims, some in his party who urged the emancipation and equality of African Americans, and critics in the North who were willing to let the South go without argument. Lincoln faced other seemingly intractable problems. Foreign countries like Britain and France, who hungered for Southern cotton and toyed with the idea of an alliance with the Confederacy. Southern sympathizers in the North, who spied covertly and agitated overtly against the Union. And border states that allowed slavery and tentatively resisted secession. To achieve his aim, Lincoln expanded the powers of the presidency in unprecedented ways. His actions in Maryland proved he would be no pushover president, as many of his critics believed. He arrested and detained Southern sympathizers in Baltimore upon hearing of plans to sabotage railroad lines leading into Washington, D.C. To do this, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, the idea that governments must have clear evidence of a crime before imprisoning a citizen, one of the most cherished civil rights of the English-speaking world, enshrined in the Magna Carta and in Article 1, Section 9 of our own Constitution. Lincoln's decision remains controversial today, but he insisted the dire circumstances required such a drastic action, saying, "Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated?" Lincoln also took on more power during the times that Congress was in recess and put the railroad and telegraph under government control, essentially nationalizing private corporations. In addition, emancipating the slaves required at least a congressional action, yet Lincoln, as commander-in-chief of the Army, saw emancipation as a military necessity. The presidency therefore became the dominant branch of government during the war, as it often does during times of crisis. It took the impeachment of Andrew Johnson after the war to bring the power of the branches of government back into balance. The war altered many other aspects of the country as well. The northern economy moved into heavy industrialism, mobilizing to equip a huge military endeavor. After the war, techniques of mass production were applied to making steel, building bridges and railroads, and producing consumer goods like canned food and clothing. In addition, the war affirmed the supremacy of the federal government, and the question of secession was at least tabled for the moment, until Rick Perry broached it again in 2012. Taking advantage of the absence of Southern legislators, Congress used federal land to populate the West with the Homestead Act, to enable the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, and to support agricultural and mechanical colleges in the West. The economic destruction and environmental degradation wreaked by the war relegated the South to poverty and economic backwardness for over a century after the war. The war changed the Constitution as well. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments became some of the most significant changes in constitutional history. Watch as Reconstruction historian Eric Foner explains.
Well, the three Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th, the 13th abolished slavery, the 14th established the principle of equal citizenship, the 15th tries to give black men the right to vote. These are all things which the federal government couldn't have conceived of doing before the Civil War. But the war itself empowers the national government, and the abolition of slavery leads, after a terrible political struggle, to the incorporation of black Americans as equal citizens of the society. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments each ends with a clause saying Congress shall have the power to enforce this amendment. In other words, it gives Congress the right to protect the basic rights of American citizens. And even though those basic rights of blacks were soon violated and taken away, really, in many of the southern states, nonetheless, those amendments remain in the Constitution, and a century later, they would be the basis, the legal constitutional basis for the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s. 100 years later, those amendments, Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts during Reconstruction, said were sleeping giants in the Constitution. And they did sleep for a long time, but then they were reawakened by the Civil Rights Movement and became the basis for the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s.
In the beginning of the conflict, the Union followed Winfield Scott's strategy to blockade the coastline to prevent European aid from reaching the South, control the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy, and secondarily capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, to strike a blow to Southern morale. The strategy was developed to combat a small insurrection, and the Union did not initially have the necessary riverboats to implement the plan, so it did not end the rebellion quickly. Although the strategy was not initially successful, the South felt the blockade's effect in late 1863. The first 2 years of the war went poorly for the Union. Incompetent generalship, led by George McClellan, botched several opportunities to strike a winning blow. Europe watched intently, looking for some significant sign of Confederate strength and Union weakness that warranted an alliance with King Cotton. However, the Battle of Antietam settled the question. Although technically a tie, Antietam allowed Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which discouraged a British alliance with a slave-holding Confederacy. Because he freed only the slaves in the areas of rebellion, Lincoln kept the valuable border states in the Union, but changed the moral focus of the war to a higher good, emancipation. African Americans rallied to the cause. Who better to fight for a union that would grant them freedom? Although discrimination and prejudice caused many doubters to question the courage or aptitude of African Americans, nearly 200,000 served in the war, 40,000 dying for the cause. Despite giving the last full measure of devotion to the Union, these soldiers were paid less than their white counterparts for much of the war. Not until 1864 did Congress rectify the situation and authorize equal pay for equal service. Women, too, earned respect for their actions during the war. Barred from combat, women worked outside the home as nurses, clerical workers, fundraisers, and spies. These women went on to push even more vigorously for the right to vote, especially after the 15th Amendment granted suffrage to black males. As the war dragged on, Union generals Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman, and Philip Sheridan took control of the Union armies and implemented what Sherman called total war, destroying all materials, food, provisions, and clothing that might prove useful to an opposing army. Civilians were no longer exempt from what Sherman called the hard hand of war. The Army marched from Tennessee to Atlanta, then Savannah, destroying everything in a 40-mile wide path. The general's capture of Atlanta had political implications as well. Lincoln's re-election, largely in question in the uncertain days of the war, was assured in the election of 1864 with the fall of Atlanta. Lincoln's second inaugural address calls upon the newly reunited nation to bind up the nation's wounds to achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace. He remained firm in his conviction that secession was not possible in a democracy, and so refused to treat the South as a conquered nation. Instead, he focused on asking individual Southerners to reaffirm their allegiance to the newly reunited nation. States were restored to full status in the Union when 10% of Southerners took the loyalty oath, where they promised to remain loyal to the Union in the future. He, of course, died before he could formulate a more substantive Reconstruction plan, and Southerners remained recalcitrant and intransigent, finding ingenious ways to prevent African Americans from voting without specifically using race as a determining factor. For example, literacy tests and poll taxes targeted newly freed slaves, while whites-only primaries effectively determined what candidates would stand in the general election. Grandfather clauses exempted most Southern whites from these onerous obstacles to voting. Radical Republicans in Congress, no longer held in check by Lincoln and provoked by the thought of former Confederates serving again in the national government, imposed their version of Reconstruction. Dissolving the South into 5 military districts, radical Reconstruction took away civil liberties from Southerners and treated the region as a conquered nation. Civil rights legislation passed by the Radicals worked to restore some of the civil liberties stripped from the freedmen. The industrialization of the United States after the war soon distracted Americans from the plight of the South and her newly freed slaves. Reconstruction ended with the contested election of 1876, and a congressional committee cobbled together a compromise. Republicans would retain the presidency with Rutherford B. Hayes, and the South would be freed from Reconstruction. Many of the tactics used to prevent voting, as well as Jim Crow laws that established segregation, survived Reconstruction. Watch this clip, again from Foner, where he summarizes the importance of the period to American history. Good luck on your test, and if you have any more questions, please visit the Piazza website to discuss them with your peers.
How do you assess the successes and failures of Reconstruction and its overall legacy to the country?
Well, Reconstruction did not succeed, at least certainly in its broad aims. The aim was to create a functioning interracial democracy in the South. Its aim was to entrench the notion of equal rights, equal civil rights, equal political rights for blacks in the society. Well, it didn't work. Those rights were eventually taken away, and for a long time they were violated. On the other hand, Reconstruction created a window of opportunity in which many forms of progress took place. Blacks were able to create their own institutions, churches, schools, families. Many of them did acquire land eventually. Although another failure of Reconstruction was that the large majority of blacks were left in a status of dependence, economic poverty and dependence on whites. So Reconstruction lays the groundwork, you might say, for future struggle. You know, the civil rights movement of the 1960s is called sometimes the Second Reconstruction. It built upon the aspirations, the tactics, the legal doctrines of the first Reconstruction, but it took a full century for the country to again try to live up to those ideals.